Okay, the YouTube process is almost there. All right, I think that is up and running. All right. Like I said, good afternoon to everyone. As I mentioned in my WhatsApp advertisement for today's class, the Joseph saga is one of the most well-developed and intricate of all of the tales of the Torah and the rest of Tanakh as well. Really, it only gets challenged, I would say, by the stories of King David. But we don't have time to go through every single aspect of it. But instead, I want to take a look at a small slice of life from the middle of the encounters between Joseph and his brother during the, well, let's call it the process of reconciliation. Let me give just a quick recap, since we are jumping into the story midway, actually about 2/3 of the way through. So Joseph, you may remember, was the firstborn of Jacob's favorite wife, Rachel. And as such, Joseph was given special attention, special clothes, and a special status within the household of Jacob. This bred a lot of resentment among his brothers. Joseph himself was also responsible for bringing bad reports about them, which is something we've looked at in other classes. And in general, there was a great animosity, which was only fed when Joseph decided to share his amazing dreams about how one day he would rule over them all. Clearly, this did not earn him any greater friendship, and instead they began plotting how to kill him. After having plotted, they then decided maybe not to kill him. Instead, they decided, under his brother Judah's instructions, to sell him. Because after all, if they're going to get rid of him, why not make a little money in the process? Joseph gets sold, ends up down in Egypt, ends up becoming a slave to a man named Potiphar, gets in trouble with his wife, ends up in prison. There in prison, he interprets the dreams of the cupbearer and the chief of the bakeries, and such he allows him to eventually get into the service of Pharaoh. In the service of Pharaoh, he predicts the 7 years of famine and the 7 years of plenty, followed by the 7 years of famine. He is put in charge of overseeing the preparations. And when the years of famine strike, Egypt is ready. And let's just say his family back up in the land of Canaan are not so ready. And as such, the brothers come down to Egypt to buy food. And they come face to face with their brother, but don't recognize him. And in the first meeting, Joseph gives them their food, gives them back their money, and also tells them, and also keeps Shimon as a prisoner and tells them, return with your other brother, your younger brother, or else you'll never see him again. They go back home, they hem, they haw, and eventually Jacob relents and says, yes, it's okay to take Benjamin, even though he's the last good son I have from the good wife, Rachel, just showing that he really has not quite fully learned the lesson from his favoritism of Joseph. He allows Benjamin to return. Benjamin is there, and now we are picking up the story with their return and the meeting of all of the brothers with Joseph. All right, so that was a 4-minute synopsis of the Joseph story so far. Hopefully you can tell there's a lot more going on than what we're going to have time to discuss today. And hopefully if you have not yet studied it with more detail, go back and look through my own archive, as well as you can go to Sefaria and look at the amazing commentaries from the last few thousand years that help give us more insights on the rest of the story. But we're just going to look at a slice, that re-meeting of Joseph and now all of his brothers. Everyone with me so far? Anybody totally lost by my summary?
We're with you.
Okay. All right. So we're picking up in chapter 43, verse 15. And it starts off, so the men, meaning the brothers, took that gift, and they took with them double the money as well as Benjamin, meaning they are coming down with the money that had been returned to them secretly, which made them rather anxious, and they're bringing back their brother Benjamin, which is what Joseph, who they didn't know was Joseph, had demanded. They made their way down to Egypt, where they presented themselves to Joseph. When Joseph saw Benjamin with them, he said to his house steward, "Take the men into the house, slaughter and prepare an animal, for the men will dine with me at noon." So apparently, they are getting now special treatment. They are coming back with Benjamin, and this has created a situation where Joseph is not only going to give them the food that they're coming and release Simeon back to them, but is inviting them to lunch from freshly slaughtered food. This was unusual. It was unusual for the Egyptians to eat with these foreigners. It was doubly unusual for them to be invited into the house of the second in command of the entire country. Verse 17 continues. The man, meaning the steward, did as Joseph said, and he brought the men into Joseph's house. But the men were frightened at being brought into Joseph's house. It must be, they thought, because of the money replaced in our bags the first time that we have been brought inside, as a pretext to attack us and seize us as slaves with our pack animals. So the brothers are like, whoa, wait a minute. What are you doing inviting me into the house? The last time we went into your house is when we ended up with like stuff snuck back into our bags, and that's what's created the tension that we're feeling right now. They are suspicious of this lunchtime invitation. And like I said, rightly so. They have evidence that the last time there were some shenanigans, and they are very, very wary of what comes next. So they are fearful. And so verse 19 continues to then have them act on this fear. So they went up to Joseph's house steward and spoke to him at the entrance of the house. They basically stop at the front at the door and say, whoa, before we go in, can we just have a quick word? Can we just talk a little bit? If you please, my lord, they said, we came down once before to procure food. But when we arrived at the night encampment, meaning on our way back home, and opened our bags, there was each one's money in the mouth of his bag, our money in full. So we have brought it back with us, and we have brought down with us other money to procure food. We do not know who put the money in our bags. So, displaying a very good being very good role models, they are being very open and honest at the beginning of this conversation, saying, wait a minute, guys, wait, before we go in, I just want to make everybody clear. We know that money got put back in our bags. We didn't do it. We didn't take it, and we've brought it back. So if you want to accuse us of theft, here it is. We didn't steal anything, and we want to buy new food, and here's new money to buy that. So they are trying to be as open and honest, really to cover themselves and make sure there can't be a sudden accusation when they step into the house. He, the steward, replied, all is well with you. Do not be afraid. Your God, the God of your father, must have put treasure in your bags for you. I got your payment. And he brought out Shimon to them. All right, so let's just unpack what the statement is here from the steward. So he is saying the God of your father, which is already very, very telling, because obviously the God of their father is Adonai, but he's also the God of Joseph. But they don't know that. Must have put treasure in your bags for you. He's basically saying, must have been a miracle. And then he lies, kind of, by saying, I got your payment. Well, of course, it would have been Joseph, which took care of covering any expenses for the food that was given to them. So the steward is saying, look, you're good. There's no debt. You don't owe us anything. Whatever money was in your bag, God must have arranged that to happen for you. So he brings back their brother, Shimon, who, remember, has been held as a captive during this entire time. And they are now reunited, all 11 of the brothers, plus Joseph, which they don't know, but now together again. Verse 24. Then the man brought the men into Joseph's house. He gave them water to bathe their feet and provided food for their asses. They laid out their gifts to await Joseph's arrival at noon, for they had heard that they were to dine there. When Joseph came home, they presented him with the gifts that they had brought with them into the house, bowing low before him to the ground. He greeted them and said, how is your aged father of whom you spoke? Is he still in good health? All right, so he is making both polite conversation from their point of view. After all, they had said, we couldn't bring the young lad, Benjamin, because our father depends upon him. And now they have come with him. So he's making polite conversation, maybe. But of course, from Joseph's point of view, he is probably worried that Jacob might have died before this reunion could be finished. They replied, "It is well with your servant, our father. He is still in good health." And they bowed low and made obeisance. So they are being very, very deferential, very, very polite. They're not pointing out, well, the only reason he might not be well is because you forced us to bring Benjamin. They are being as polite as you could possibly imagine. Looking about, he saw his brother Benjamin, his mother's son, meaning this is his only full, both mother and father brother, and asked, "Is this your youngest brother of whom you spoke to me?" And he went on, "May God be gracious to you, my boy." With that, Joseph hurried out, for he was overcome with feeling towards his brother and was on the verge of tears. He went into a room and wept there. So we can see the depth of his emotion of feeling this reunion, this potential reconciliation. And it really is one of the more emotional scenes, in my opinion, in the entire Torah. Then he washed his face, right? He gets ready to go back out in public, reappeared, and now in control of himself, gave the order, serve the meal. They served him by himself, and them by themselves, and the Egyptians who ate with them by themselves. For the Egyptians could not dine with the Hebrews, since that would be abhorrent to the Egyptians. Like I mentioned, they had a prejudice in Egypt about eating with these foreigners, these Ivrim. As they were seated by his direction, from the oldest in order of his seniority to the youngest in the order of his youth, the men looked at each other in astonishment. So he arranges them around the table in correct order, from oldest to youngest, which, since they weren't wearing name tags and since all of them were being born from different wives at different times, would not have been readily apparent, is rather impressive that this strange guy, who's really has been behaving weirdly, would know exactly which brother was older than which. Portions were served for them from his table, but Benjamin's portion was several times that of anyone else, and they drank their fill with him. All right, we're going to leave the story there, but I just want you to appreciate the immense awkwardness of this dinner party. Just imagine that you are one of the 12 brothers or 11 brothers sitting around this table and watching everything play out. You already feel weird because he took one of your brothers captive. Now he's treating you like honored guests, but he forced you to show up with this other brother that you said you shouldn't bring with, but he still seems to care about how your dad's doing. And the money that you brought back is not being accepted, but is being said is just your own treasure. And then he arranges you as though he has some like intimate magical knowledge of who you are. And he's showing favoritism to the youngest brother. Just, could there be a more awkward dinner party for these 11 guys? It is extremely, extremely difficult for them to sit through all of this. And on the other side, it is extremely difficult for Joseph to arrange and set everything in motion, to put the brothers in their place, and to have all of these emotions of, you sold me into slavery, and yet you came back, and you came with Benjamin, and yet what is your feelings towards Benjamin? What would your feelings be towards me? What happens next? I believe that Joseph himself was probably surprised by the strength of his own emotion towards seeing his brother Benjamin, which is why he had to make his hasty exit for crying at that moment. But this has to be one of the more uncomfortable for everybody involved dinner parties that I've ever seen. But before we jump into our commentary of what we can learn from this dinner party of doom, are there any questions or additional comments people would like to make?
The parallels with the reconciliation of Jacob and Esau, we're told the brothers are afraid. Jacob's afraid. We're told they have a gift. Jacob has a gift. The brothers have a gift. Their greeting is not really what they expected, but they're still not sure.
Which was the same, which with Jacob and Esau. Jacob did not expect Esau to be friendly, and yet he was.
And we have that in the text in that reconciliation where they kiss, but is it really a kiss or a biting of the neck or what else is going on? So there, and I think the repetition of this is very much about developing emotional intelligence, which is one of the great teachings of Torah. So what are we supposed to be learning with all of these emotions? And the other thing is, very rarely are we told how people feel. And we are here. And that just sets everything up.
That is true. The Torah often does not give us the intimate emotional and psychological life of the people that are on the page. Usually it expects us to understand or interpret that from their behavior and actions, which is what, to be honest, is what we are left with in the real world, not in the book, not in the world of the book, because in the real world, we don't get the inner monologue of anyone except ourselves too. But here we do get more hints, we get more clues. And indeed, throughout the Joseph saga, we get more information about what the brothers were feeling about him, what Joseph was feeling about situations, what Mrs. Potiphar was feeling about. We see a lot more of those internal glimpses than we do in almost any other part of the Torah. And that, I think you're right, is very much about teaching us this emotional awareness and empathy, which is one of the underlying themes of the Joseph saga, is about that empathy for other people. Because almost all of the situations within the Joseph saga are built out of problems with not understanding what another person feels in that situation. And the obliviousness leads to, shall we say, regrettable consequences. With that in mind, unless there are other questions or comments, just checking on YouTube or Zoom, not seeing anyone. Oh, yes, go ahead.
I like the fact that he gives his brother Benjamin, who they don't know, several times more than anyone else. I wonder if he's looking for a reaction from his other, kind of like, why did he get more? I think there's a kind of setting the scene for you know what I'm talking about.
Absolutely. And indeed, many commentators agree with you that this is a test. First, asking for Benjamin to come down and also holding Shimon hostage, and now the giving of additional portions is a test to see whether or not Benjamin, who has become the new favorite of their father, is facing the same animosity, rivalry, hatred that Joseph faced from his brothers when he occupied that position. And the fact that they don't seem to respond in that way, and as we know from the story, will eventually stand up for Benjamin and be willing to put themselves into servitude in order to spare him and spare their father, shows to Joseph that indeed they have learned from their treatment of him, that they recognize that what they did to Joseph was not only to Joseph, but it was also to their father, and it was to the rest of the family. And they seem to be willing to recognize that maybe what they do has to focus on more than just their own hurt feelings and their own personal anger at the situation, that maybe there is a larger set of circumstances and other people's emotions that are worthy and necessary for our consideration. So yes, absolutely, this multiple portion was a very deliberate act by Joseph to get that whole thing moving, or part of the whole thing moving. All right, so let's take a look then. Oops, let's zoom in a little because that's too small to read on any screen except a very big monitor. Let's take a look at some of our commentaries on this. So we're going to begin with Sforno, who, again, is going to give us what we just mentioned. He invited them to the meal in order to observe how they related to Benjamin, and to test how they would react when he would shower gifts of so much greater value on Benjamin. So we see, exactly as we discussed, that this whole meal was set up as a test, that this whole meal was set up so that he could gauge their reaction. Rabbeinu Bachya says something a little different. He wants to know, why is it that the brothers, and I'll just draw your attention back to the text because it is a little shocking once you recognize that you should be looking for it, that when the brothers talk to the steward, or right before they talk to the steward, and they are feeling their fear, he says, they say it is a pretext to attack us and seize us as slaves with our pack animals. And it's like, wait a minute, why do they mention their donkeys? I mean, I get that you're afraid someone might attack you. I get that you're afraid of being forced into to slavery. After all, you know what that's like when you did it to your brother. But why are you worried about your donkeys? So Rabbeinu Bachya is going to try and give us that understanding. At first glance, the brothers' concern about their donkeys appears disproportionate, understatement, to their fear of becoming slaves. In this instance, not only did they worry about being deprived of their donkeys, animals which represented a lifeline, but they were even more concerned about these animals not carrying grain back to their families in Canaan. Their concern over their donkey was then only a veiled form of their real worry about their families starving to death if they did not return. So continuing that theme of showing the development of their empathy and of their feeling for others, yes, they're worried about their personal safety and their personal freedom, but their concern about the animals is not about their property. The concern about the animals is about, if we get taken as slaves or attacked, then that means no food is going to go back home, and that means everyone back home will die. So their concern for themselves is parallel to the concern for others. And indeed, that is the level that we should aspire to, that we don't only think about ourselves, or we don't think about ourselves first, but we think about ourselves plus our families, and hopefully an ever-expanding range of others to also have empathy for their situation. And he goes on to say, we find something similar in Exodus 17:3, when the Jewish people accused Moses of having taken them into the desert to kill me, my children, and my cattle by thirst. Normal people would not worry about their cattle in such contexts, seeing that their own and their children's lives were in jeopardy. But the Israelites mentioned the cattle as in their trek through the desert, these animals were a lifeline for them. So again, it wasn't just that they were worried about the cash value. They were worried about what function these animals served within their current situation. If the animals died, even if they didn't, then that would also jeopardize the entire ability to continue and their survival. You can't really make it across the Sinai Peninsula without the pack animals to help you. So it was a broader concern than it might have first appeared. Questions or comments on those first two of our commentaries? Okay, let's get into our big discussion. And our big discussion is going to be tracing a pattern through all of the Joseph saga. So we're going to hit on a lot of different points. If there's any point that you don't remember or understand from my quick summary or your own readings, let me know, because we're going to be covering a lot of ground to understand some of the underlying issues in all of this, in particular, Lashon Hara. Remember, Lashon Hara is the catch-all phrase, often used more generically, especially in Musar texts, which is what this is from, as an inappropriate speaking about others. And see another extremely awesome thing, meaning impressive thing, which unraveled itself in the course of time, measure for measure. The term midah k'neged midah, measure for measure, is a standard term used in Rabbinic Hebrew, meaning, for lack of a modern term, karmic payback, to use the vernacular, not to actually use the proper Hindu understanding, that as you reap, so you sow. If you do X, you will get negative X back to you. That there are reciprocal, proportional reactions, or as Newton said, to every sin there is an opposite and equivalent punishment. So whenever we hear measure for measure, that's what the rabbis are talking about. For Joseph stumbled in the sin of Lashon Hara, right? He committed Lashon Hara. He spoke evilly against his brothers. excuse me, as we saw way back at the beginning of the Joseph saga, as related in the Torah. And his brothers did not want, by any means, to forgive him, relating to him in the extreme of din, of judgment, right? So they say, look, he spoke against us in Lashon Hara. We need to punish him in the most extreme way possible, which is let us go and kill him. So the first, the instigation was his slander of the brothers, which was reciprocated by an overreaction and judgmentalism by the brothers in retaliation and a refusal to forgive him, which then led to their attempt to go and kill him. However, they did end up wishing to sell him as a slave because of this. Why? Though Judah defended him and did not allow them to kill him, when he said, what profit if we kill our brother? He by no means wanted to forgive him. Let us go and sell him. So Judah steps up in the middle of that early phase of the story, looking almost like somebody who will rescue Joseph by saying, let's not kill him because what do we gain by it? But then we realize, no, he is actually meaning we should gain by it. Let's sell him instead. Clearly, he is still not interested in forgiving him, even if he is trying to avoid murdering him. Because of this, in the succeeding generations, when one of the seed of Judah stumbled in Lashon Hara, the seed of Joseph would by no means forgive him. All right, what in the world are we talking about here? We're talking about the descendants of both Judah and the descendants of Joseph. Now, who are the descendants of Judah? Well, the descendants of Judah are the people from the tribe of Judah. And as we're going to see, there's no more famous member of the tribe of Judah than that guy called David. And who are the descendants of Joseph? Well, pretty much anyone from Ephraim or Manasseh are the descendants of Joseph, which are two of the other major tribes, which will figure prominently in our next section, right? So he asked the question outright, and who is it that stumbled in this way? Meaning who engaged in Lashon Hara among the descendants of Judah that caused this problem and that caused tension between him and a member of the descendants of Joseph? No less than our Lord King David, may peace be upon him, who believed the evil of Siva spoke that the evil that Siva spoke of Mephibosheth, and said in 2 Samuel 19, verse 30, you, Mephibosheth, and Siva shall divide the field. All right, so quick background. If you have not been keeping up with your reading of the book of Samuel, David was in a lot of trouble and many different points of his kingship from his own family. And in particular, there was always a tension between himself and the descendants of Saul and the other people of the kingdom of whether or not another person would try to seize the throne. When Siva, who was one of the descendants, Mephibosheth, one of the descendants of Saul, was accused, was framed as having been one of the co-conspirators with Absalom, who was trying to seize the throne, Absalom being one of David's sons. Mephibosheth's servant, Siva, spoke against Mephibosheth. He basically slandered. And David accepted that slander and basically transferred property rights from Mephibosheth to Siva. Now, Siva was lying. He was slandering and sorry, I got my name split. Mephibosheth was lying, and Siva was actually innocent. And under the situation, we then hear when David went along with this Lashon Hara, that a heavenly voice came forth and said, Rechavam of the seed of Judah and Yaravam, the seed of Joseph, shall divide the kingdom, which is, of course, what happens after David's son Solomon passes away. The kingdom of Israel gets divided between the north and the south remaining in the hands of the kings of Judah, which are descended from David, and the north being given over to descendants of Joseph, Ephraim and Manasseh being the dominant tribes of the north. So because David went along with the Lashon Hara, his whole kingdom ends up being divided. Now, you may be saying to yourself, wait a minute, I thought the kingdom was divided because Solomon worked the people too hard And his son, Rehoboam, didn't give them enough of a break after Solomon died, and instead decided he would, work them harder. And yes, that is the proximate cause, meaning that is the more immediate trigger to the issue. But what the text here is trying to argue is that it was David being willing to go along with the slander and the scheming that set in motion the process that would lead to that eventual division. And the idea here is that a kingdom that is run by somebody that is willing to listen to slander and make such proclamations off of it is eventually going to fall apart. And indeed, of course, that is exactly what happens. And it's reminding us that this Lashon Hara is as important, if not more important, because of the groundwork that it laid for a kingdom of mistrust and lies, is as important as the more immediate economic and political mishandling following the succession of Rehoboam from Solomon's death. All right, so that was a long detour, but I want to try to make sure we understand that this is come back to that the idea is that we are talking about Lashon Hara. Right? The underlying cause was David's acceptance of Lashon Hara. He listened to it. Remember that it's not just forbidden to give lies or slander about another person. It is also forbidden to listen to lies and slander about another person. As our sages of blessed memory said, if David had not accepted Lashon Hara, the kingdom of the house of David would not have been divided, and Israel would not have served idolatry, and we would not have been exiled from our land. All of this is measure for measure. Because David listened to the slander and divided the land into parcels from Mephibosheth and Siva, so too David's land was divided. Midah keneged midah, measure against measure. All right, everybody following so far of this idea that from Judah's and Joseph's rivalry over the Lashon Hara Joseph was saying, we end up with the division of the kingdom of Israel. Okay, now let us see the suffering that came to them from heaven because of their sitting down to eat bread before selling Joseph. So we've seen the punishment that came to Joseph because of his Lashon Hara, but let's look at what happened on the other side of the equation, because the brothers aren't saints, and they sat down to eat bread. Now you may remember that when they threw Joseph into the pit, intending to simply leave him there to die, so that their hands could be, in quote, clean, that they left him in the pit and sat down to have lunch, which is really a very callous and cruel thing to do. So now, how does that play into our story? For when they brought Benjamin and stood him before Joseph, they thought that they had satisfied his demand and that he would permit them to return home. But it was not to be so, as it is written, and Joseph saw Benjamin with them, and he said to the overseer of his house, bring these men, where's my mouse? Bring these men into the house and see to it to slaughter something for a meal and prepare it, for with me these men dine. And they heard and they would eat bread there, and the men were afraid, for they were brought into the house of Joseph. And they said, it is because of the money that was returned to our sacks, and they'll fall upon us and take us as slaves. And he said, place bread. When he gives the orders to serve them. And they sat before him, firstborn according to his seniority. So a quick synopsis of all of the text that we read. Now, what's going on here? Well, this is a replay of the meal the brothers had when Joseph was in the pit. They sat in comfort and ate even while Joseph was suffering. And now Joseph is going to sit and eat relatively comfortably while they suffer and wonder what fate awaits them. So this idea of midah keneged midah, just as they sat in callousness and fear while Joseph was afraid, so too they will be afraid now sitting during this meal. And similarly, the entire episode of the goblet, everything centering around the meal, where they saw the goblet by which he divined, for if he had not invited them to dine with him and to see the goblet, they could not in the end have been suspected of theft and undergone the great suffering whereby they all consented to become slaves. So he's pointing out that there is a beautiful symmetry to all of this, that the meal was not just an aside, an accidental edit of the narrator, that this was orchestrated precisely to give a proper reflection of what had first happened when they threw him in the pit and sat to eat and then sold him as a slave, to now come in mere reverse form for them to sit and suffer while the meal is taking place, and then be put into a position where they will be sold as slaves, or at least they think they are going to be sold as slaves. All right, is everybody following the logic of this, the symmetry of midah kineged midah, of measure against measure? Okay, let's finish up this explanation and see if I can't. Nope, don't think I can quite get the rest of it on at once. Okay, but in truth, all this was measure for measure. Because of their sitting to eat bread when Joseph was in the pit, it was decreed upon them to also sit and eat bread under terrifying circumstances, until Judah himself said, "What shall we speak and how shall we justify ourselves? God has found out the sin of our servants. Behold, we are slaves to my Lord." Now, remember that when the brothers first got into the trouble, when they came down into Egypt the very first time, they immediately said to themselves, "It's because of what we did to Joseph." So they are already mentally associating what's happening to them now with the crime that they committed. They didn't say it's because of some other sin that they might have committed, but they immediately believe that what's happening to them in this whole episode around the food and with this potential for becoming slaves is tied to how they treated their brother. All right, behold, we are slaves to my Lord. And with this, he averts the essential din for the selling of Joseph, meaning that by having actually confessed and taken responsibility and being willing to accept the punishment, that just as we sold him, we too should be sold, that they are now removing that as a blight from their ledger. They are doing proper tshuva publicly in this position. They have reached a similar situation. They could have let Benjamin be taken unjustly, but at least they would have saved their own necks. Even though Benjamin is the favorite, they decide to stand up for him because they are thinking not of themselves, but thinking of their father. They don't actually know whether Benjamin is guilty or not, although they, I'm sure, suspect that he is innocent, just like they were in the first trip. But that is put aside for the concerns of their father. They want to make sure that he will not suffer with Benjamin having been stolen from him the same way that Joseph was stolen from him. And they already know exactly how bad that felt. And Judah in particular knows how bad that felt, because Judah also had children lost to him who died during the story of Judah and Tamar, which is another example of midah kineged midah. And though Joseph is not yet reconciled in this parasha and says, "The man in whose hand the goblet is found, he shall be my servant, and you go up in peace to your father," Judah does not agree to this. And Judah drew near, Vayigash, from next week's Torah portion, drew near and until the end of the episode. And Joseph could not restrain himself, meaning he finally admits who he is, and they are fully reconciled to each other. And this begins the process of bringing the family down into the land of Egypt. And from all this awesomeness, what are we supposed to learn from this, right? From all this awesome episode, we can understand how much one must guard his tongue and his deeds. And also from the account of Joseph, we can understand his holy trait. "And now do not be grieved and do not vex yourself that you sold me here," because he admits that he was also partly in the wrong. And he admits that in the end, it has worked out to be in a position where he can save the family, for the famine will continue. And similarly, at the end of the parasha, "And he comforted them and spoke to their hearts." So Joseph clearly has forgiven them 100% completely, and they have fully accepted responsibility for the crime they committed against him. They have all recognized that they each contributed in different ways. Joseph through his lashon hara, the brothers through their rivalry, anger, and sale of him, that they have all acted terribly, and that all forgive each other and all are seeking forgiveness from each other. And witness further the greatness of Joseph, who did not tell his father, something which is often debated, what had been done to him until it was revealed to him prophetically before his death, meaning that Jacob learned it prophetically. As it is written, Jacob speaking, the brothers, embittered him, and they antagonized him, and they hated him, meaning that Jacob knew this, but only knew it through prophetic revelation, not because Joseph told him. And more than this, we find in the words of Chazal that Joseph took care not to be alone with his father, so that his brothers not suspect him of telling his father what he had suffered at their hands. That last part in particular, I think, is a beautiful interpretation that Joseph now has reached a point of empathy and compassion for his brothers, that not only has he forgiven them, not only has he reconciled to them, not only does he now show them unlimited love and assistance, but he also recognizes that they are probably still worried, that they are probably still worried about their relationship with Jacob, their father. That if Joseph goes and explains to Jacob what happened, if Joseph tells them that, tells Jacob that they sold him, that there will be irreparable damage done between them and their father. And so, in order to allay their fears, the rabbis believe that Joseph made sure that he was never alone with Jacob. Thus, the brothers would never have to be worried that he had told Jacob what had happened during that private time. And that is a limitation that Joseph put on himself in order to protect his brothers from that feeling of desperate fear, and which also shows Joseph's amazing growth. Because remember, Joseph first brought tales to their father about the brothers. Now he's got some really good dirt on the brothers, some really whoppers of problems that they committed, and he keeps his mouth shut. Because what good would it do? Is that going to help anyone in the family? The brothers and Joseph are reconciled. They both recognize that they have all grown and that each is repentant of the different problems that they contributed to. What would be the purpose of smearing the brothers' names now? Now that everything has been fixed and the relationship has been restored, there is no purpose to dig up this old bone and drag it out in front of Jacob, or to hold it over the brothers as some sort of cudgel. And this idea of when we have truly reconciled, not needing to remind a person of their past crimes, not needing to constantly tell others of their past crimes, is a very important lesson, and one that I think we often overlook. Too often people, even when they have mostly reconciled to a particular problem, are always tempted to bring it up, are always tempted to either remind the person or to share it with someone else. And we see from this idea of this bit of musar, of ethical guidance, that is not necessary. Yes, there are some times, in particular cases where especially if someone has not repented and they are still a danger to themselves and others, where we do need to speak up. But very often the problems between people, once they have been reconciled, the best thing to do is to leave them reconciled and not go back to it over and over again. And that was what eventually allowed Joseph and the brothers to be reconciled and for their families to be reconciled, so that by the time we leave Egypt, when Moses brings us out, we are leaving as one group, one family again, not the separated group. And it is only when David gives in to Lashon Hara later on that our nation gets divided once more. And that, is the ultimate problem with Lashon Hara. The way we speak about others in negative and hateful or slanderous ways is what drives us further and further apart. It's kind of the main reason that Shmirat HaLashon wrote his book. Okay, so that seems like I was going on a very long narrative there, but I wanted to bring this full commentary because I really thought that this was an interesting way of looking at the full Joseph saga through that narrow lens of the dinner that they sat down to, and it would let us talk about many of the major issues that are still very relevant to us today. We may not be selling each other into slavery. We may not be having the issue of going back and forth to Egypt for food. But the family dynamic is one that continues to be very relevant and plays out over and over again in so many households. And learning from what our ancestors both did wrong and did right is one of the main pleasures and benefits of studying Torah. Questions and comments?
A comment.
My question would be, oh, okay, John, go ahead.
Oh, I think you've got the floor. Go ahead.
Oh, okay. How did they explain to their father that Joseph was alive in Egypt? I mean, they came back with his bloody coat, but no body. I mean,
Well,
it's
I mean,
hard for me to believe that they kept quiet.
So I think that it very much proves the old truism that if you're watching an action movie and you don't see the body, you should always assume the person's still alive, right? It's every time someone says, "Oh, we defeated so and so," if you don't see the body, chances are they're still alive. But more to the specifics, they presented him with the bloody coat. If they had come across the body, they obviously would have presented that to their father as well. So Jacob, I'm sure, could have rationalized to himself, they found the blood, they found the coat, they assumed that he was dead, and so do I. And it's normal for beasts to kill and take the body and it never be found. So he just assumed that in the normal way of life that his son had been killed. And now he is relieved by some miracle that he wasn't. And clearly he can tell him that he was a slave. He doesn't have to explain how he got sold because people were kidnapping slaves all over the place anyway. So I think it would be entirely plausible for Jacob to have not figured out the Joseph and his brother's problem, except by prophetic revelation. On the other hand, perhaps he figured it out earlier. On the other hand, perhaps the brothers told him earlier. And there are many different lessons we can learn from those different interpretations. But Shmirat HaLashon wants us to try and use the logic of there being no explanation as a moral teaching for us. And it's not meant to be the definitive and only interpretation of the events. That's why we have multiple commentaries. But it is meant to be an example of what moral lesson can we learn from this particular set of interpretations.
I was going to say in the modern code of judicial conduct, there's a requirement that if two people are in dispute, the judge never is alone with one party in order to avoid what could become a conflict based on appearance. So Joseph here, by taking care not to be alone, he's avoiding even the appearance that he is perpetuating conflict, because the whole purpose is to effect reconciliation. So to do anything that would call that into question by creating a bad appearance, he goes above and beyond that requirement in order to avoid the appearance of perpetuating conflict so that we can see the reconciliation as complete.
That's a very good analogy. I wasn't aware of that one from the Judicial Code of Ethics. Thank you. Any other questions or comments? All right, then we will leave it there for today. Tonight we have Mishnah class. We should be finishing up Kritot. A reminder that if we do, here's hoping that next week we'll be starting Hulin and looking at the different laws of kashrut for Mishnah. That's tonight at 7 o'clock. If you need the information, check out our website or just email me or use the WhatsApp to get that. And tomorrow we'll be back on Pathways because it's not Thanksgiving. So I will see people hopefully then, or perhaps on Friday or Saturday for Shabbat. And please continue to have a wonderful Hanukkah celebration.
Thank you, Rabbi. Chag Sameach.
Hanukkah Sameach.